In a sealed evidence box at the St. Louis County Circuit Court, a knife sits in a plastic bag. The knife was used in 1998 to kill a 42-year-old former reporter named Felicia Gayle in her own home in a quiet suburb of St. Louis, Missouri. When the knife was tested for DNA in 2016, the genetic material recovered from the handle did not belong to the man who had been convicted of the murder. It did not belong to Felicia Gayle. It belonged, the laboratory determined, to the assistant prosecutor who had handled the knife in the courtroom in 2001 without wearing gloves, and to the investigator who had passed it to him. The DNA had been on the handle since 2001. It had been deposited by the two men who were, at that moment, working to convict a different man of the crime. The different man was Marcellus Williams. He had already, in 2016, been on Missouri's death row for 15 years. He had always maintained that he had not killed Felicia Gayle. On September 24, 2024, 23 years after his conviction, and 8 years after the DNA results confirmed that the knife handle carried no useful identification of the killer, Marcellus Williams was executed by lethal injection in a prison in Bonne Terre, Missouri. He was the 100th person executed by the state of Missouri since the resumption of capital punishment in 1989. The prosecutor of St. Louis County, who had petitioned the state in the months before the execution to vacate the conviction, issued a statement after Williams was pronounced dead. Marcellus Williams, he said, should be alive today. What follows is a summary of the case on which Williams was convicted, the doubts that were raised about it in the years before his execution, and the sequence of decisions by Missouri officials that kept the execution on its scheduled date despite those doubts. It is not the final word on his guilt or innocence. A state court found him guilty. Higher courts, including, on the day of his execution, the Missouri Supreme Court and the United States Supreme Court, declined to overturn that finding. The Innocence Project, the Midwest Innocence Project, and the elected prosecutor of the county that had first charged him all reached the opposite conclusion. The case deserves to be told with both of those positions in view. Felicia Gayle was 42 years old on the day of her death. She was, by the account of everyone who knew her, a careful and accomplished woman. She had worked as a reporter for the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, the region's largest newspaper, for several years. By 1998, she had moved into the nonprofit sector. She was married. She was known in her community. She had a home in University City, a leafy suburb on the western edge of St. Louis. On August 11, 1998, Felicia Gayle was stabbed to death inside that home. Her husband found her body when he returned from work. The investigation that followed did not produce any physical evidence connecting a specific person to the scene. Marcellus Williams, 29 years old at the time, was charged with the murder based primarily on the statements of two jailhouse informants. The first informant, a former girlfriend of Williams's, who was facing drug charges, told police that Williams had admitted the murder to her. The second, a man who was in jail on other charges at the time of his statement, told police that Williams had confessed to him in a holding cell. Both informants had prior criminal histories. Both had pending cases that benefited from their testimony. The first had also, by the time of her statement, applied for a $5,000 reward that had been offered in the case. The trial took place in 2001. The jury consisted of 11 white jurors and 1 black juror. The prosecutor had, during jury selection, struck 6 of the 7 qualified black jurors from the panel, a pattern that would later be cited by the Innocence Project as consistent with racial discrimination in jury selection. The jury convicted Williams. The judge sentenced him to death. Williams, an observant Muslim who, during his years in prison, would serve as an imam to other inmates, and publish poetry under the name Khalifa, continued to maintain his innocence. In 2016, under a court order secured by his defense team, the DNA testing of the knife handle was finally completed. The results excluded Williams. They did not, however, identify an alternative suspect. The DNA recovered from the handle had been transferred by the assistant prosecutor and the investigator who had touched the knife without gloves in preparation for trial. Those transfers had contaminated the sample beyond the point at which any original killer's profile could be recovered. The knife, in other words, could not prove who had killed Felicia Gayle. It could and did demonstrate that Williams was not a match for the profile that had survived on the handle. In August of 2017, hours before his first scheduled execution date, Missouri Governor Eric Greitens issued a stay. He appointed a 5-member board of former judges to examine the case and report back to him on whether Williams should be executed. The board was dissolved in June of 2023 without issuing a report by Greitens' successor, Governor Mike Parson. Missouri Attorney General Andrew Bailey set a new execution date. In January of 2024, the elected prosecutor of St. Louis County, a man named Wesley Bell, filed a 63-page motion with the state of Missouri asking the courts to vacate Marcellus Williams's conviction. In his filing, Bell stated that new evidence, including the 2016 DNA results and additional documentation of the jailhouse informant's histories, demonstrated that Williams was factually innocent of Felicia Gayle's murder. The prosecutor's office of the county that had sent Williams to death row was, in 2024, asking the state of Missouri to reverse its own verdict. In August of 2024, an agreement was reached between Williams and the prosecutor. Williams would enter what is known as an Alford plea, a plea that does not admit guilt but acknowledges that the state has the power to convict in exchange for a sentence of life without parole. The execution would be called off. The family of Felicia Gayle had, from the beginning, indicated that they did not want Williams executed. They supported the Alford plea agreement. The agreement was signed. On August 21, 2024, Judge Bruce Hilton rejected the agreement. He ordered the original conviction and sentence to stand. On September 12, 2024, the Missouri Supreme Court unanimously upheld Hilton's ruling. On the afternoon of September 24, 2024, with hours remaining before the scheduled execution, the United States Supreme Court declined in a divided order to issue a stay. At approximately 6 o'clock in the evening, in the execution chamber in Bonne Terre, Missouri, Marcellus Williams was executed by lethal injection. His final written words, composed in the days before his death, were made public afterward. They read, in their entirety, "All praise be to Allah in every situation." He was 55 years old. He had been on death row for 23 years. The murder of Felicia Gayle, by his death, moved out of the category of open legal questions and into the category of executed convictions. Convictions that, under American law, can no longer be vacated because the defendant is no longer alive to be freed. The state of Missouri did not, at any point between 2001 and 2024, formally find Williams innocent. The state's position at the moment of his execution was that he had been lawfully convicted by a jury that had heard the evidence, and that no appellate court had found sufficient grounds to disturb the verdict. That is one position. The opposing position, held by the elected prosecutor of the county that had originally charged him, by the Innocence Project, by the Midwest Innocence Project, by the Equal Justice Initiative, by the family of the victim, and by a substantial body of legal commentary published after his death, is that the evidence against Williams was never of the quality required to justify any conviction still less a death sentence. The two informants had powerful motives to lie. The physical evidence exonerated him, or, at minimum, failed to implicate him. The racial composition of his jury raised concerns about systemic exclusion. The DNA contamination on the knife was itself a form of evidence destruction, committed by officers of the court. On that view, Marcellus Williams was executed under a cloud of doubt that should have been enough, at minimum, to commute his sentence to life. Wesley Bell, the prosecutor whose office had filed the 63-page motion to vacate the conviction, issued his full statement after the execution. "If there is a shadow of a doubt about a person's innocence," he said, "the death penalty should not be an option. This result does not serve the cause of justice. The actual killer of Felicia Gayle has never been identified. The DNA that was present at the scene before the assistant prosecutor and the investigator contaminated the knife in 2001 has not been recovered. It is, in all practical respects, gone." Marcellus Williams, in the years of his imprisonment, had studied scripture. He had written poetry. He had led prayers for other inmates. He had, by the accounts of the correctional officers who worked with him, been an unusually composed presence on a death row populated largely by men less at peace with where they had ended up. He was executed by the state of Missouri on September 24, 2024, at approximately 6 o'clock in the evening. His final words thanked God. Whether the state of Missouri, in executing him, had acted in accordance with the standards of justice it claimed to uphold is a question that will not be settled by any court. That question has passed out of the jurisdiction of judges. It belongs now to the historical record and to the conscience of a country that, on a September evening in 2024, executed a man whose own prosecutor had publicly begged it not